in the United States and the world?
At the current time, I think our answer to you was 9. We have built 12 plants. We've built plants overseas, but at the present time, we have 9 plants in our fleet.
Are there any others in Pennsylvania?
We owned the Armstrong plant for a while as part of our Tenaska Power Fund, and that was sold. So at the present time, no, we do not own any other plants in Pennsylvania.
What types of violations have your plants received?
I don't think we have any violations.
None at all?
Not that I know of.
Never ever?
No. Yeah, violations are things you really don't look for. You work very hard to prevent. For instance, violations would come primarily, I think, from emissions operations. And in 2008, we won a national award for being the most conservative and best plant operator for emission of plants in the United States. When you're running one of these gas turbine power plants, you have constant monitoring mechanisms on many, many areas. And for instance, one of the aspects is the fuel itself coming in. It's kind of like that old statement, whatever you put in is what you get out at the back end. Natural gas that's delivered to these plants through a pipeline will have a certain part per million sulfur content. They're just natural in that sort of fuel. And so when you burn natural gas, you'll get a certain amount of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. Now, if you happen to own a diesel car and you drive that diesel car, you're going to get those same emissions. And so when you look at one of these plants and you're operating as the operator, there are limits, and they're very tight limits, down to less than 9 parts per million for the most part. And when you monitor your fuel, you monitor your emissions, and it's all very closely coordinated. If you see that you're beginning to get close to margins, well, then you'll throttle back. In other words, you decrease the productive value of the plant so that you always end. And it's one of these, all power plants are required to do this. I know of no violations in Tenaska plants. I would say that most generators look very severely on any violations. Now, I think probably what might elicit a question like that is when you hear about the nuclear plants are under a severe amount of pressure for lots of reasons. And, there's been situations where guards were found sleeping at the gate, and so they got a violation. And we're not in any way, shape, or form required to meet nuclear plants because we're not a nuclear plant. But so I think, a violation would come if you had released, I'm going to say, oil or something off your site into the streams. It would come from an emission standpoint in a gas turbine plant.
Or use more water than you were permitted for.
Use more water than you were permitted for. You almost couldn't do that. In other words, once you're permitted for a certain amount of water, and that's why we, for instance, the number 8 million and 5 million has come up. The overall is 8 million. The actual use is about 5 million. The whole reason you get a permit for 8 million is if in that worst case scenario, which comes when the temperatures are the hottest, and somebody says, run this plant 24 hours a day, we have to be able to do that. And so we'd probably, in the worst case scenario, use 8 million gallons on that day. If you were in a situation where this plant was built, and it was existing, it was operating, roughly from 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and one of the local utility plants were to simply interrupt operation and trip offline for Lord knows what reason, they might call this plant as the dispatcher, as well as they might call the AES plant and say, you folks run all 24 hours today at maximum load because we need that to balance the grid. And so that's how you might get to a point where you'd use the maximum amount of water, but you would never use more water than you were permitted to, just by basically the way the plant's designed and operate. You build that in. That's part of the conservative nature of these things. It's just like the dual fuel question. If you're running and you're in a peak period and people's rates depend on being sustained at a better value, and all of a sudden power is not available and they have to go out and buy power at a high rate, that frustrates all the controls and conditions. So what happens in something like that is that you turn to one of these plants and you say, run and sustain that to keep it down. And I may have lost my train of thought there a little bit.
That's
but,
okay.
Hopefully that answers it.
All right. I think, Stephanie, have you been in touch with the Susquehanna River Basin Commission about the idea of drawing water from the Susquehanna River? And if so, what did they say?
We've not been in touch with the Susquehanna River. We recognize the steps, and we have, but we don't really have a good thing to discuss with them at this point. You know, we're looking. In other words, it's just like people would like answers, but if you haven't thought through what you want to do, in other words, to go to the Susquehanna River Basin at this point and say, hey, we'd like some water, they've probably got a long list of people that want that. You've got to be far more well prepared. You want to say that we want this much water, here's the period in which our withdrawal. And just as I'm explaining here in operation of one of these facilities, you point out to people when your major draws would be, when your minimal draws would be, and that helps them in their planning. For instance, a gas turbine power plant running in Lebanon would probably consume most of its water in the March through September time frame, and that affects the river basin differently. There may be others that, you know, for barge traffic need the river at certain levels to move goods up and down the river. So all that fits in. So we need to go with a well-prepared document. We just haven't put that document together yet. We're working on it, but we're not